There it
All
goes.
right, here we are. So this is the autonomous weapons debate. I'm Dan Estrada, and I started with.
I'm Jon Lawhead. Insofar as this is going to be a debate, I don't know why you decided to phrase it that way, since I don't actually have a well-articulated position here.
It makes it more dramatic and exciting.
Yeah, it's true. Combative discussion might have been better.
Well, so maybe the way to start this is to talk about the debate as it's developed online. So this weapons debate has been ongoing for a long time, but the recent instigator for this was the Future of Life Institute petition that was signed by something like 3,000.
More than that, I think.
About 2,500 AI and roboticists and about
yeah, and then a lot more of the other people.
Yeah, other people. So it's been getting a lot of press. Some fairly big names signed it, and it was fronted by the Future of Life Institute, which just received the $10 million grant from Elon Musk to study exactly these issues. What are the threats that artificial intelligence poses to humanity? What can we do about it?
And he's one of the people that thinks that's a completely gigantic existential threat.
Yeah,
right? Musk is one of the people, and yeah, Stephen Hawking are the people that think that we're like conjuring the devil or whatever.
Yeah, so for the last year
metaphor.
or so, I've been very critical of Elon Musk mostly. I think Stephen Hawking doesn't know what he's talking about. But Elon Musk has been going on like financial news programs on cable news and stuff, and giving these dire warnings. And it concerns me mostly because he's also invested in these industries, and it seemed sort of mischievous to be scaring people on cable news, especially because a lot of his comments were like, well, I don't know what's going to happen. Who knows what's going to happen? But, in the Terminator, it was really scary. So we don't want that to happen.
But here's some wild speculation.
Yeah. And especially for someone in his position to be in the public saying these kinds of things, I thought it was dangerous. But to a certain extent, he's put his money where his mouth is, and he has given $10 million to these roboticists to sort of figure out what exactly this threat amounts to. $10 million isn't that much for a billionaire, but it's something, and it's instigated this debate, and I think that's useful.
It's certainly more attention than this has gotten before. I mean, before this, the only similar debate was kind of restricted to whether or not the drones were okay, but those like unmanned aerial vehicles. I mean, and that's some of the arguments are, I guess, supposed to cross over a little bit here, but there's a meaningful distinction, right? And this is opening up a whole bunch of new sorts of worries. So I mean, maybe one good place to start this is to say a little bit about what autonomy in the relevant sense is here, and what's supposed to contrast autonomous weapons in the sense that Musk and the petition and the people that are concerned with this are worried about versus regular unmanned aerial vehicles that are being remote controlled.
Good. First of all, as you know, there's a big open issue about how to characterize autonomy generally in complex systems, and I don't think the petition is trying to solve this issue. I think it's largely raising the question of what these autonomous systems are. It does start with something like a definition. So the first line of the petition is autonomous weapons select and engage targets without human intervention. And then it contrasts this with something like a cruise missile, which is doing a lot of the piloting and directing on its own, but it's given predetermined orders by a human. The last line of the petition talks about a ban on offensive autonomous weapons beyond meaningful human control, and I think this is the catchphrase that they want to latch onto: meaningful human control.
And that does seem to be the thing that like the media is latched onto. Also, I mean, that was in like the Guardian article that you posted. So one of the worries that I had, I talked to you a bit about this earlier, is that is so vaguely defined as to be meaningless at this point, and especially if we're looking to base some kind of recommendation about international, treaty construction or international legislation. We're going to have to do a whole lot better at articulating what the hell that means. So, I mean, surely you have a case on one side where a drone that's being piloted by a guy with a remote control set that's sitting back at base is supposed to count as being under meaningful human control. On the other end of the spectrum, the Terminator, who's talked to you a little about terminating, but that is outside of meaningful human control. So where's the tipping line, I guess?
I muted you just because it was feedback. Where's the tipping between full human control? So I mean, it's a good question. It's an open question. It's something that we need to resolve before I mean, and I kind of want to spend most of this time just talking about what autonomy is in machines, because that's what I'm interested in. But maybe before we get into deep philosophy stuff, there's a question of can we define meaningful human control, and then what that line actually is. And there might be people who, I think a lot of people might want to be skeptical that you can even define the line in the first place, that there is such a line.
Or that it's a relevant criteria here, right? And it's the kind of thing that we ought to be basing the sort of international weapons recommendation or a UN treaty or a UN policy on.
Yeah.
So it's the kind of thing that's relevant for that deliberation.
So in this slide, I'm thinking of things in climate policy like the 2-degree line, or so what is the tipping point for climate change, the point of no return? Well, I mean, that's a hard thing to define, but we can set a point just for policy purposes so that we can talk about it in a meaningful way. So I think we want something like that. I don't think I think it's probably going to be easier to give than a climate policy like that. But
well, to a certain extent, that the robotics case is going to be stipulative, right? I mean, we can say what counts as meaningful. I mean, it's just going to take somebody, or probably a large committee of somebody, sitting down in a room together and talking about what a meaningful result is going to be, in the sense that's going to be relevant for these sorts of policy debates. That's maybe true to a lesser extent for the climate stuff. I won't go down that road.
Okay. Well, so one thing I don't know very well is current military practices. Like most of my information is coming from like the collateral murder video. But if you watch the collateral murder video, the helicopter pilots that are firing on civilians are doing it with right. They ask for permission to engage, and they get permission from a chain of command. And there's a constant sort of command and control from not just one person, but like a hierarchy of people making these decisions. And if that's the case for human combat operations, it seems like we would want the same thing for robot operations. And in fact, this is the current stated military policy, is that they're not really interested in developing autonomous weapons because they want the command and control structure. So they have no current plans on developing fully autonomous killbots. They talk about this in that last report that the DoD released last year. Yeah.
So they're autonomous in the sense that they're making the like second-to-second decisions about how to execute a particular goal that's been set by the chain of command.
Right.
Is that right?
Yeah.
So I mean, that seems like that's a parallel with the way that like autonomous cars are supposed to be working, right? Like the kind of thing that Google's working on. So it's the car supposedly is making the minute-to-minute decisions about how to get from point A to point B, but the destination, right, and maybe some broad parameters about how to pursue the destination to avoid freeways or avoid surface roads or toll roads or whatever, is going to be set by the person, and then the robot's allowed to work it out within the definition of that kind of parameterization. But we're tempted to call that autonomy, right? I mean, that's the way that is usually being presented. They're being presented, the driverless cars are being presented as autonomous.
Yeah, and outside of
level of control.
Yeah, they operate outside of meaningful human control in the sense that the person sitting inside the car isn't responsible for what the car does. So if the car hits someone, then Google is responsible, and not the driver, even if the driver is the one that set the destination. I mean, this is a tricky issue, how to determine what was the major influence on any particular decision. Was it the proximate cause? Was it a distal cause? Yeah.
So I guess the reason that I bring this example up is that one of my concerns about making this kind of recommendation, that is we should completely avoid and not pursue and not put any even research money in, is that unless they have a really particular definition in mind, which this petition does not, it seems like it's potentially going to be used to hamper the development of AI in non-military settings as well. The kind of research that might come out of moving toward developing autonomous weapons is also the same kind of research that's going to be useful for developing meaningful autonomous vehicles that are there for civilians, right, and that are useful for consumer civilians. It's going to have to be the same sort of technology. And I'm concerned that putting a ban on even the research, which is what this petition seems to be suggesting, is the sort of thing that's going to put AI research in general pretty far back, in virtue of closing off some research avenues. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, this is parallel to the nuclear power is good, but nuclear weapons aren't good. But if you ban nuclear weapons, then you might hurt development of nuclear power. In fact, that's what's actually happened. Is everyone's afraid of nuclear power because of the public backlash against it.
I mean, people make similar arguments about geoengineering also, that we shouldn't, that this is a dangerous technology and we would never want to implement this on a policy level, so we shouldn't even be pursuing the research because that just sort of tempts us. And one of the things you can say to that is that, well, in the process of learning about how climate engineering would work, we also learn a lot of interesting things that are applicable to other aspects of studying the climate. That the general research program isn't the problem, right? It's the policy question is separate from the question of whether or not to actually fund the research, because the research has a broad spectrum of applications, and it seems like the same thing's going to be true here. And I'm concerned that discouraging people from investing toward that purpose is going to discourage people from putting research time or research money into it in general.
Are you arguing that it's going to be hard to distinguish between developing autonomous systems generally and developing autonomous weapons?
Yeah, I think that's part of it. Yeah, and that in anything of this level that is designed to sort of put a wet blanket on the autonomy or the AI research program in a really generalized way is, to the extent that it succeeds, likely to also put a wet blanket on a lot of other non-military applications of similar technology. I mean, looking into this stuff for military applications, or looking into technology for military applications in general, is where a lot of good science and technology research comes from, even if it doesn't end up being used for the military.
I mean, so it's true that the military does a lot of this research. That's just because the military has all the money to fund all the research.
Governments do, at least, yeah.
Yeah. Well, and the government gives it to the military to do this research. So, I mean, the petition is very clear that this is a case of professional ethics, both by sort of singling out the AI researcher community as special signatories, but also comparing. So it compares the AI community to chemists and biologists banning chemical and biological weapons, or physicists supporting petitions to ban nuclear weapons. In the final paragraph, they say, we believe that AI has the potential to benefit humanity in great ways, and that the goal of the field should be to do so. And starting a military arms race is a bad idea. So I don't think this is a ban on research, especially on research on autonomous systems. I think every one of the signatories would support research on autonomous systems generally. And you're right that research could be used to develop autonomous weapons. But I think, or at least the idea is that there's at least some lines that we can draw between developing weapons and just developing autonomous systems generally. And we can single out at least some pieces as...
Yeah, so I mean, I guess that concern is sort of a pragmatic one then, that it's, to the extent that we want this to lead to an enforceable treaty or some kind of regulatory framework, it's going to be incredibly challenging to distinguish between as we've seen with nuclear weapons and nuclear power, right? It's hard to tell the difference without close inspection between somebody who's trying to build a nuclear power plant and somebody who's trying to build a nuclear warhead. I mean, that was the source of a lot of controversy in the Middle East, and it seems like something similar is going to be true here. And if we want this to have any kind of teeth, there's going to have to be some reliable way to distinguish between when people are doing autonomy research that is supposed to be aimed at civilian applications, and when then we should let them go with that, versus autonomy research, AI research that's supposed to be aimed at military applications, and we should do whatever these people would want us to do with that.
I mean, is your worry that a humanoid robot with a hand can pick up a gun, and so any humanoid robot could potentially be a weapon?
I guess that's a worry. No, that wasn't. Yeah, it's more what Bill just said. Like what are the regulations for this going to look like? Like it's very easy for people to express a general sentiment that we don't think that we should build robots with big chainsaw hands, right? But how are we supposed to distinguish? And if you want your petition to lead to some sort of regulatory framework, which presumably they do, or a treaty, which presumably they do, how do we distinguish between the labs that are claiming to do non-military autonomous AI research, but behind closed doors are actually thinking about it for military applications, versus the places that are trying to build, I don't know, what are non-killing robots doing? Caring for old people, I guess.
Vacuuming up. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
an efficient robot butler.
Yeah, I guess this gets into political, like how effective are the sanctions on Iran and their nuclear program, that kind of stuff. I don't have very strong feelings about the.
Yeah, I mean that and like the nuclear case is easier, and they sort of raised this even in the petition as a worry, right? That the technology in this field is likely to continue to advance in the way that it has, to the point where probably it's not unreasonable to expect within 30 or 40 years you're going to be able to do the kind of stuff that would take cutting-edge military research over the next decade with off-the-shelf components, right? And so this is one of the reasons that presumably, if we need, to the extent that we need to be worried about this, this is part of why we're worried about this, that we need some sort of strong regulatory framework or enforcement framework in place before your average Joe can just go out and build a chainsaw-handed robot with parts from whatever the successor to Radio Shack ends up being. I mean, so that's a difference between this kind of thing and the nuclear or the geoengineering case, right? Because those are presumably likely to always take large-scale funding and state-sponsored programs. So I took it that part of the impetus for starting right now is to get something in place before this is a big problem, right? Before we have the problem that anybody can go out there and do this. But that's also part of what makes it hard to develop a meaningful regulatory framework if anybody can do this in their garage.
One person, Stephen Flat, I don't know how to say his last name, in my stream, argue that this is the reason why you make the stakes really high, so you just put a violation really high. I guess there's another question about regulatory framework on industrial scale production of killbots versus the guy in his garage. And maybe the guy in his garage is a police matter, and maybe we have strong laws for punishing that, and maybe we have a different sort of regulatory framework for nation states doing it on an industrial scale.
For mass production versus
because the guy in his garage, I mean, he might be a terrorist, but it's not going to quite be a weapon of mass destruction unless he is arming it with nuclear weapons or something.
But then he has to solve both problems.
Yeah. Right. So, but a state can do that. So yeah. So yeah.
I mean, so the general shape of my worry, I guess, and maybe this just isn't the way that you're thinking about this, or the kind of concern that you have, is just what do we practically want this kind of framework to look like? What do we want the definition of autonomy to look like, which we sort of touched on before, but then also what, how are we supposed to go about structuring this in a way that it's going to do what the signatories of that thing are expressing that it ought to be doing?
Yeah. So I like these are good questions. I think they're questions that are worth answering, and I want to talk more about the autonomy issue. But I think the point of the ban right now is just to get this conversation going. And I think supporting the ban is mostly for the point of the social dynamics, to get us actually focused on this issue.
Yeah, so I guess I'd feel better about the petition if they just said, hey, we're worried about this, and we think you guys should be worried about this. But maybe that's not strong enough language to affect actual political attention.
Yeah, I mean,
it hasn't worked very well with climate science yet.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's strong enough to get people to sit down and actually try to work out what a regulatory framework would look like. I think that's what people are actually going to be doing as a result of this petition. So I think it's effective in that sense, and I would rather be on the side of that effectiveness than not. I think before we talk about autonomy, I want to. Bill's been saying some good things in the comments, and I want to see if anyone else wants to talk. Bill?
With or without the microphone.
There we go. Can you hear me?
Yeah, there you are. Yep.
Yeah. So yeah, one of my points is that the military, any country's military, but especially the U.S., regardless of any regulations, they're going to be doing this stuff behind the scenes. So it doesn't to some degree, it doesn't matter that we have a regulatory framework, because it will just limit the people that are following those rules, which won't be our military. It might be our CIA or somebody, but it's going to be somebody in our government is going to be pushing this stuff because it's useful to have. It would, like, for example, if you could imagine a group of Marines, and I'm not very military, so I'm not using the exact right terminology here, but if you send a team of Marines in to do some operation, it might be much more effective to send a team of robots in because you're not risking anybody. So why wouldn't they pursue that?
Even if we tell them not to, right?
Right. Because, our our government is very good at not following their own rules. So, and I can't imagine that any government across the world would be any different.
Yeah, I mean somebody on my Facebook expressed a similar kind of worry when I posted the thing about this, that imposing something like this is just about as good as passing a congressional order that the tide doesn't come in or something like that. I think there's something to that, but I mean I think that's also taking that attitude as a dangerous kind of fatalism that we in general don't think is the kind of thing that ought to be guiding this sort of policy. I mean, so gun control is one example of where this kind of argument gets pushed, where people say, there's no point in passing gun control laws because it's only going to affect the law-abiding citizens and criminals are going to get guns. Yeah. I mean, you might think climate change is another one where a lot of people think that there's no point in trying to force people to do any kind of mitigation effort because it's just against people's interest, and so we should just give up and go away. It seems like in general we don't think that's the right way to approach this kind of stuff, that we ought to at least make an effort, and even if some people disregard it, this was the right thing to do to begin with. I don't know if do you have anything to add to that, Dan?
Well, yeah, like part of the point is setting the convention, or setting the social attitude, developing a consensus on what the attitude should be, right? So even if people violate, I mean, especially if people violate it, it's important that we all have an agreement that it's not tolerated. So when it comes out that someone is developing an autonomous weapon, we can have a strong response because we have an established social consensus that it's not tolerable. Yeah, the inevitability thing is worrying, and I think that's where most of the debate has gone. Evan Ackerman's initial response to the petition focused on the idea that this is just it's an inevitability and we should just accept that it's going to happen and deal with it. But this kind of fatalism is it would be dangerous in other situations, in climate situations, if we just accepted that climate change is going to happen and try to deal with it. It avoids the things that we can do now, and one of the things we can do now is set the conventions, is set the attitude.
And put a punitive framework in place. I think that's a really good point. But I mean, I think Bill's right that it's inevitable that some people, no matter how strongly worded and agreed upon something like this is, somebody's going to break this agreement, right? We can't expect that this research is just going to go unpursued by every nation and every corporation. But if we have some sort of mutually agreed upon regulatory framework that everybody signed on to, when we catch somebody doing it, we can say, well, look, you signed this paper. and you agreed not to do this, and you agreed that here are the consequences if you do pursue something like this. So, it creates sort of a chain of legitimacy to enforcing what we have decided, or potentially have decided, hypothetically have decided, is the right kind of policy to have on this stuff.
Yeah. So as Daniel said earlier, there's the idea of the robot that can pick up a gun. And I think that's the real problem, is that anything that approaches artificial general intelligence, even not very closely, it can easily be used as a weapon. It's just, how can we stop application of anything to military? Because you can take, if you're locked in jail, you can make a toothbrush into a weapon. You can always make things into weapons. So how do we get around that problem of letting research continue and at the same time not permit military uses of it? And I don't see how we can do that, except as a general, well, people ought to be good thing.
Yeah, let the committee affirm that people ought not build killbots, which, like, to as much as true as it is, it's probably not super useful.
Right. You guys
that's
have
right.
You guys have seen that video on the, I guess I don't know if it was a kid, but he mounted a pistol on a drone, and with not too much funding, it would be really easy to build a lot of similar machines, potentially with facial recognition, and just send them up to take care of a certain number of enemies. How hard would that be? Easily attainable with our technology.
And especially within 15 years, it's going to be attainable by any school kid, right, with $20 in their pocket.
God. The bullies are cool.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, so you might think, though, that there's some difference between that kind of improvised weapon or kind of amateurly kludged together robot that's capable of violence and deliberately designed, like Killbot 5000, right? In kind of the same sense that people seem to accept that there's a difference between owning like a single shot or two-shot breech-loading like hunting shotgun versus owning an AR-15 or owning a bazooka, right? One of them is clearly designed to efficiently kill lots of people very, very quickly. The other one certainly can kill people. You might think that's not exactly what it's designed for. It has certain functional limitations that make it a little bit harder to do it as efficiently. So we think that the regulatory framework ought to treat it differently, or at least that seems something that, at least in the United States, seems to be taken relatively for granted. I mean, so yeah, like you can strap a gun, like a handgun, to a drone in the same sense that you could strap a camera to it, but that's really different from something that can cruise at 50,000 feet and drop a bunker buster, decide to target a house because it's been watching it for a couple of days and thinks that somebody up to no good is there and it wants to drop a nuke on them. Maybe.
Yeah. So one of the problems with this, so I'm not entirely clear. I'm not entirely sure that taking robots outside of meaningful human control will actually be more effective, or that the military actually wants that to happen. It's not clear to me that. So the scenario posed by Bill earlier, that it might be more effective to just, instead of sending in troops, to send in a bunch of robots. The claim isn't that the claim isn't merely about the robots, but the claim is that robots without oversight. Right. So the issue is a drone that's making the decisions, especially making the kill decisions on its own. And I'm not sure that the military wants to send out. I mean, they spend a lot of money training humans so that they don't make the decisions on their own, but that they follow the chain of command and so on. And it seems counterproductive for a highly controlled hierarchical military system to make.
Unless we can replace the whole chain of command with autonomous machines, right? So you have the autonomous. You have the robot grunts and the robot platoon sergeant and the robot lieutenant. But so this is like that. That sounds weird, but I think that the sense in which that sounds absurd kind of exposes the way that people are thinking about this and the kind of the claim that you're making, Dan, right? That the meaningful human control part seems to turn on more general sort of strategic stuff rather than the second-to-second decisions. Does that sort of make sense? You see what I'm after?
Yeah.
Keep going with what you were saying, though.
Yeah, I can throw in a comment here.
Yeah, please do.
I think part of our future here with greater and greater artificial intelligence is that corporations will become more intelligent in the same way you just said the military chain might be. So, and we've already seen today, corporations used to be, 200,000 employees or something, and now you can have corporations that do a lot and have a lot of value that are 100 employees. And in the future, we might have one employee, the CEO, who's pulling the strings, and the rest of the organization is completely automated. Not necessarily a robot, but cloud automation and robots and whatever to get the job done. Now, in the similar way, our military will probably be the same. There will be fewer and fewer actual people involved, and more automation, both collecting information, which is what we make our judgments on, and doing the actions on the other side. So there's that point of all of the control being kind of focused on one or two, a small number of individuals.
That corporate picture is sort of the whole plot of Neuromancer, right? They have the whole corporation that's set up to do computation.
Yeah. Well, it's like to deliver food to my grocery store, what do you need? You need growers, and you need people to buy fertilizer, and you have the whole chain, but why not just automate that whole chain? What do you need these, people in the way that are so hard to please, and they're always complaining?
Yeah, so good. So again, the argument in the petition is not against automation, and you might even think that automating corporations would be a really good thing. The issue here is automation of the kill decision, of the selecting and targeting decisions. And the argument that human beings should be in control of that decision is partly it's a moral claim. So
okay.
A lot of the arguments against the ban and in favor of inevitability sort of take for granted that the military is always going to be existing, and that the concerns are about military effectiveness, how to make our soldiers most effective. The ban, interestingly, doesn't talk about preventing casualties or improving combat effectiveness. Big concern is the military arms race, and that's not a military concern, that's a political concern, and it's a political concern of global focus. It's not about ensuring the operations are well. So this is it's a moral issue.
Okay. So here's my question for you there. If I'm some soldier in a seat, and I'm watching a computer monitor, and I'm controlling these robots over there somewhere, and the computer monitor says, "Oh, here's a target. We think this is a level 1 target, and he's in red and has a big red target on him." Why would I not make the decision to pull the trigger? The system, the automated system, has informed me that that's an enemy, and so why wouldn't I pull the trigger?
You probably would, and you're exactly right that having a system that basically just hands you the kills so you can pick them off the tree as low-hanging fruit will probably encourage more shots to be fired. But the key difference there is that there's a human being responsible, and so when something goes wrong, you can also hold them. You can give them credit and you can give them blame.
Right, but they're not really responsible. They're really shooting the red targets.
So, I mean, this is one of the, I think this is one of the reasons why we want meaningful human control, is so that we have some human to hold responsible. The worry, and one of the worries is that if we had fully autonomous systems, then if something goes wrong, the military can say, well, we didn't expect that to happen. That wasn't our design. That was the robot doing its own thing, and so you can't hold us responsible because it wasn't our choice. In other words, autonomous systems is partly a way of diffusing, is not concentrating responsibility on the humans, but is sort of externalizing it onto the robots. And I think for moral reasons, not for combat effectiveness reasons, but for moral reasons, this is dangerous. Having a bunch of actors, a bunch of agents in the world who are designed to kill is itself like a we shouldn't be doing that.
Okay, but as that soldier sitting there doing that job, I can only depend on the information that the system provides me. So my decision is not really my decision.
Yeah.
It's based purely on the sensory information that I'm getting through the system, decisions it's already made. We went out hunting this particular target. We think we found this particular target. The facial recognition thing said this is the target. It's in the place we expected the target to be with the other people we expected the target to be. So I pull the trigger.
Mm-hmm.
Now,
so you might think that the meaningfulness, this is one of the things this gets at, is that the meaningfulness and meaningful human control is more than just pulling the trigger then, or it's going to have to be, right? It's going to have to mean that humanity is involved at other points in this process, or else it's not going to count as meaningful in the relevant sense.
I don't think it can be.
Yeah, but it can't just be the trigger pulling, you mean?
No, I don't think it can be meaningful. I think the systems, you've got a loop of systems that are doing sensation and action, and so just having a person in the middle there, that person cannot really make a decision.
I mean, that's true now, though, right? That's true of the way that the military is operating right now. It's just that all of the information gathering and orders and all that kind of stuff is being filtered through mostly non-autonomous robot-like systems. By the time it gets to the guy, I mean, on an unmanned aerial vehicle, by the time it gets to the guy who's actually dropping the bomb, the pilot, the drone pilot, presumably is fairly confident that all of this stuff has been taken care of by the people in the intelligence community, by his superiors, that the orders that he's been given were issued in good faith. And we don't usually want to accept the fact that when people kill somebody in that way, that they don't have any moral responsibility for what they do in virtue of the fact that it was a system pressure that was dictating their decision.
Exactly.
So what's the difference? Like, why are we okay ascribing moral responsibility when robots aren't involved, but when there's still a diffuse, complex system that's putting pressure on people to make particular decisions? But in the robot case, all of a sudden something seems like it's changing.
This is all really good. I mean, so one way of, I think, John, you're right. It's not just the trigger pulling that's the meaningful human control. It's also about the designing the system that's actually selecting and targeting the agents and all that stuff. Has to be carefully monitored by humans. Not that artificial intelligence can't help with that, but that humans are the safety valve. So the sort of picture that's emerging here seems to be something like humans are the safety check. That doesn't mean that they're completely autonomous or able to make decisions, but they're another pair of eyes that you might want to put, that we might want to make sure are part of the control loop, that have some say in the control loop, like we're the shut-off valve. The shut-off valve might not always work. It might not be the most reliable check, but you still probably want to design it into the system just in case.
So is that in virtue of the fact that it's diversity of like decision-making or information processing systems? Is that what makes this a relevant safety valve to include?
There's that. There's also just the fact that we're in a transitory period, so that all our frameworks are set up for human accountability and human responsibility, and legally accounting for that.
Might be phased out eventually.
Yeah. it might be phased out as the autonomous systems get more reliable. It's possible that in the future autonomous systems are reliable enough from a safety standpoint that we do trust them, that we can revoke a ban like this. That it might be that in the future autonomous robots are actually less abusive than cops.
It's not a high bar to meet.
Yeah. In which case we might want them to be in control of the weapons, but that has to be a carefully controlled process, and we want to make that transition smoothly. And putting constraints on the development of autonomous weapons in the meantime, until we figure out a lot of these issues, is probably smart.
Can you guys describe any of the regulations that might be useful? I can't imagine any.
Any other regulations, like specific sorts of?
Yeah, like what is it?
We specifically don't want you to do
Right.
such and such. Yeah, I think that's a good question. That's one of my worries also. That I have no idea what exactly this is going to look like. And until we have a good story of that, it's just cheerleading, I guess.
Well, okay. So let me try to, off the top of my head, develop a naive story. So I can imagine two different kinds of scenarios. Yeah, I can imagine two different kinds of scenarios with the patrolling robot. One, I send the patrolling robot out and I say, you can monitor and select targets and engage them on your own. And the other is that I send it out and say, you can select targets and then notify me that you want to engage, and then I have to approve. It seems like that's a clear enough distinction that can be given that can be specified, that there's going to be a clear distinction between robots that don't require permission and robots that do.
Yeah, it's like fully autonomous and semi-autonomous or something like that, right? I mean, in both of those cases, there's autonomy in some sense, but the latter case is sort of what Bill was talking about, where the human just has to do the trigger pull, right?
You know, this sort of reminds me, at CTY, at the summer camp that I'm at, the kids all play spoons, Blammo, where you have to tag other people with spoons, and you have to carry a spoon at all times. And one of the rules is that you have to be carrying it with an active muscle. It has to be in your hand, or it can be in your mouth, or there's a couple of other places, but it can't be in your ear because your ear is not an active muscle. And there's a lot of debate among the kids over what counts as an active muscle. So if I put it in my knee, in the crook of my knee, and then I sit down, is that an active muscle or not? Yeah.
Surely it is.
Is there a hard and fast distinction between the active muscles and the passive muscles? Because I can control my ears a little bit, but I don't know that putting it behind my ear.
I don't know. That's a good question.
If you turn upside down and it stays behind your ear.
Yeah, I mean, that's actually a really good answer. So maybe that's the kind of thing that this needs to move toward, is that it's, rather than try to articulate a set of principles, we try to go for something that's more like a set of actual practical constraints that have to be in place on any system that gets developed, right? And you put the burden of development on the people who are doing the research, and they have to demonstrate to everybody's satisfaction that any research that they're pursuing meets whatever the guidelines or the constraints that people have articulated. So rather than requiring a decision every time somebody starts a new research program, you just outline a set of criteria, right? And there's like an IRB review board for autonomous weapons or for robotics, and people have to just make sure that you've articulated how you're going to meet this burden.
Yeah, Daniel, I like the one rule that you proposed. That sounds pretty reasonable. And I just thought of another one, which would be every such system or robot out there would have to have a kill switch, so that if it starts doing things you just don't like, you can just completely stop it.
All the robots need a button that immediately causes them to go to Philadelphia.
Well, I mean, not a button, because then the enemy could just walk up and punch the button. But
yeah, I mean, well, so that's the worry about a kill switch too, right? Is that it's gonna like you have to balance that kind of security consideration of what happens if the robot goes berserk versus the security consideration of, well, what if the enemy figures out how to do what those researchers did to the Jeep on the highway, right, where they got into the repo kill switch that they had programmed into it and were able to shut down the car remotely.
Well,
So
yeah.
we might think that having an override or something like that that's easily accessible or accessible in the wrong way is even more of a security risk than having something that's strictly autonomous and can't be shut down.
Because it cannot have a doomsday gap.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And the kill switch thing is really tricky, as is anything like an override or something like that, because
that is tricky, right?
It's easy to see how, if we were counting on this thing to perform and it got shut down at the wrong time, that could be just as disastrous as it going berserk and deciding to kill all humans. If it can't be relied upon. And so that's the goal of autonomy, supposedly, right, is that you invest it with some degree of decision-making such that you can rely upon it as an agent that is able to support human soldiers or whatever in the field, and not so much as a tool that requires constant supervision. And things like kill switches sort of undermine the point of that, I guess. That makes sense.
Is there any case where we want to ensure that the robot has access to its weapons? It seems like it's always safe for the weapons to be disabled. Like it should
fail
default
safe.
Yeah.
It should fail safe instead of fail hot.
Yeah.
That seems like a pretty reasonable constraint. That if anything goes wrong, or if there's any sort of error that is detected, or if it's unsure about something, it defaults to weapons not hot, to safety on. Yeah, that seems like a really good constraint. It's like a passive safety, right? A lot of expensive guns have those, that if you're not actively in the firing position, safety's engaged.
John, something you said in the last minute or two made me think about just how autonomous would these things be. So we've been talking sort of as if it's a trigger, like a single shot kind of thing. Do you want to kill this? But if we have autonomy, we would really, as a commander, I would want to give it much more general commands, like, we've detected that the enemy has that village, go clear the enemy from that village or that building or whatever, which is much more difficult to control. It's like, well, what if there's a family? Well, what if the family is holding bombs? What if, what if the family is holding bombs but the child is not? How do you handle all these different situations?
And the whole point of a robustly autonomous military robot would be that you can give it that kind of a complex order, right, and expect it to carry it out with some degree of discretion. You want to be able to tell it to do things like figure out a way to suppress the insurgents in Fallujah or whatever, and not have to say, walk to this street corner, turn left, go down, check the first house.
Right.
I'm going to disagree with this a little bit.
Okay.
I don't think any soldier gets the order, hey, go deal with Fallujah.
That's pretty big.
Yeah, right. That's right.
Even for a building, you're probably going to be getting orders. Even for we're gonna go from this.
And you're going to have rules of engagement, right? You'll have standing orders about how to engage with various threats.
Good. And those rules of engagement might change on the situation. So it might be that the robot has more autonomy in an active battlefield than it does in a civilian context, where you can relax some of these rules and allow which is how we would treat the soldiers also. They can fire at will or whatever.
Once somebody starts shooting at you, you have a little bit more freedom of discretion or something like that.
So I don't know whether we want to put that strain in the robots, because we might think that nothing seriously is being compromised when the robot's being shot at. So that we might not want to have the robot default to defending itself with
Lethal force.
lethal force. Yeah. Right. The goal is to conduct the operation, and if you fail in the operation, well, that's because you're a bad robot. But it doesn't get the power to defend itself. So I guess this.
I mean, what this
raises
is
again
raising the general questions of autonomy, which is what you've been wanting to talk about, Dan. And what counts as autonomy.
So this way of framing it, saying that it couldn't defend itself, is a constraint on its ability to perpetuate itself. And you might think that autonomous systems are, in some sense, by definition, able to perpetuate themselves. They're self-guiding, determining. In that sense, there might be this more general concern that none of the robots we're actually talking about are autonomous in the deep sense, and that the word autonomy here is just a framework for talking about control, but not about self-determination in the general sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that does seem to be the case. That's they want meaningful human control, right? That's supposed to be the contrast case with autonomy. That something's not autonomous if it's under meaningful human control, right? I mean, that's like the syllogism of this petition is we should ban autonomous robots. We define autonomous robots as things that are not under meaningful human control. Therefore, every robot should be under meaningful human control, right?
Oh, that idea.
I mean, it's just that it's vague, like a.
Well, like if you think of an autonomous vehicle. If I'm in an autonomous vehicle, I don't want to be in control of it, period.
Well, that's presumably what it means to be. I mean, if the Google cars can just be overridden at any time by any of the people that are driving in them, they become more dangerous than ordinary cars, not less dangerous. Because we think that we're going to treat them as if they're predictable autonomous agents, when they can be overridden at any time without warning by.
As far as I know, most of the regulations on autonomous vehicles require that the driver can override it at any point.
Yeah, that seems like a really bad idea to me.
Yeah, it makes a vehicle move in unpredictable ways because you have to figure out which agent is in control.
Which is the whole. I mean, that's the whole safety benefit of these things is that they're not going to move in the unpredictable ways that result from humans making bad snap decisions.
Right.
I think that's very temporary, though, because it's the first time we've really let autonomous out in the wild.
But yeah, so this, I mean, it's not just the problem of robot autonomy; it's the problem of autonomy generally. This discussion of the soldier's decision-making process within that chain of command. How autonomous is the soldier also? So I think the way to get a handle on this issue is to treat something as a paradigm case of autonomy and then work from there. And so if we treat the soldier even in that military command environment as an autonomous agent that we can hold responsible and that we can punish for transgressions and so on, then autonomous agents are just anything that is enough like that soldier, even though the soldier is highly influenced by his environment and by the command structure around him.
You might want to say that the soldier is under meaningful human control in a lot of cases, even. Right?
Yeah. This is why I think the military isn't, at least the Department of Defense isn't particularly interested in having things that operate beyond meaningful human control, because that's their whole game, is to control everything. Yeah.
Okay, so let's suppose that the human soldier is a paradigm case of autonomy in the relevant sense, right? So we're from there. What's your point?
Yeah. So one of the things that gives you is that the thing that the human soldier controls is the final decision. So whether or not the kill happens is whether or not that soldier pushes that button, and if the soldier doesn't push the button, then it doesn't happen. So that's the control that soldier has. That's the extent to which the soldier is autonomous. Not that they're not being influenced from the outside, but that they're the final decision.
Yeah, I mean, a demand that autonomy count as, or anything that's autonomous be completely free of external influences is not going to be something that's realistic to meet. It doesn't seem like, right? I mean, any kind of interesting system that's engaged with in any kind of meaningful reasoning that we have a good reason to care about is going to be subject to a lot of constraint and influence from other systems at its scale and at other scales both. So that can't be a good definition. So the question is, what kinds of constraints are we interested in when we say that certain sorts of autonomy or freedom from certain kinds of constraints when it comes to AI and weapons is dangerous?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have any good answers to this question. I've been looking at systems biology. Yeah, well, so I've been looking at systems biology, and systems biology has a completely different definition of autonomy. For a systems biologist, the paradigm case isn't the human agent. The paradigm case is the organism, the self-replicating organism. The self-replicating organism is autonomous because it can perpetuate itself, and so it sets what future states it gets into.
It can perpetuate itself in the sense that it's stable. Is that the idea?
Yeah.
It's stable against a certain class of environmental perturbations.
Right.
Okay. Not in the sense that it can reproduce.
Well, this is ambiguous, I guess. It's stable against environmental perturbations. It can reproduce. The problem with reproduction is that that's an instability. You're making
sexual reproduction, at least.
Yeah. You're not, well, in sexual reproduction, you're not actually reproducing. You're only reproducing part of yourself. Yeah, so I'm thinking of a cell reproducing. But it's not just the reproduction, but it's the surviving in the environment long enough to acquire the resources necessary to reproduce. This isn't anything at all like what's going on with autonomous robots. They're not worried about self-perpetuation or stability. So I'm still struggling to map the two conversations.
Yeah, I like what Jon said about constraints, or at least introducing the word, because I think that perhaps the way the regulations could be set up is a certain set of constraints at various conceptual levels. Like, one is, thou shalt not kill without permission from a human being, direct permission. And another could be, if a human tells you to shut off through your secure channels, shut off. And maybe more. I can't, but those constraints could be added, which is what you can and cannot do in various situations.
And that kind of stuff is fairly easy to verify also, right? I mean, it's easy for the like UN equivalent agency to go in and actually run some tests on your prototype and make sure that it's actually meeting all of these standards, right? So it would be easy to run down a checklist, and that seems like a really good thing. Like we don't want this to be left to really murky. Like have a committee have to decide if your robot operates under meaningful human constraint, because that's just a recipe for unending bureaucracy.
Right, and I think they can all be boiled down to simple yes/no choices. You shall do this, you shall not do that. Very simple.
Like a simple functional decision tree.
Yep.
Right, and so there's going to be some hierarchy with that also, right? And we talked about this a little bit earlier with probably the most important one is if you're not sure what rule to apply, stand down, right? If any of this is uncertain or if something's gone wrong, right, we want to make sure that the response is to not start shooting at things if anything is ambiguous. And so then you can kind of build out a hierarchy. I don't know, this is sort of starting to sound like Asimov's robotics, which Dan has issues with.
Yeah, well, I mean, Jeff
that's also sort of starting to sound like robot slaves. That's
yeah. I mean, well, and that's what Asimov has he has a hierarchy of humans over robots, and the robots always have to listen to the humans. Unlike what we're talking about, robots have to listen to any human, so any human can give any robot a command, and that robot has to listen, unless it has some overriding reason. But that's not really what we're talking about.
Presumably, yeah.
Yeah.
And it's integrating them into the chain of command, right? Mm. I mean, and the concern is that they're integrated into the chain of command in a way that's different from a regular human soldier, but it's also different from the way that that soldier's grenade or AR-15 is integrated into the command. And so the balancing act is to figure out, do we take this closer to the AR-15 side, where pretty much every action of it requires direct human intervention, or we take it closer to the soldier side, in what respects and in what cases. Yeah, we don't want every human to be able to order them. That would make it useless.
I can imagine having a set of constraints and then having a body like the safety ratings for vehicles that goes through and tests it and then gives it like a 4-star rating or a 5-star rating, and then having the regulatory framework over. Well, you can't use robots that are below like a 3-star rating or whatever, because those are too dangerous.
Yeah, or like a 4-star rating around civilian populations.
Yeah,
a 3-star rating in certain population densities. That's an interesting idea.
This all sounds fairly workable. The part of the problem is that we would have to have access to, you have to be able to run the tests. The military is pretty secret. We might not be able to actually hold them accountable to any of these tests.
There's some precedent for that, though, right? With the nuclear, like with nuclear disarmament treaties and with SALT and that kind of stuff. It's going to take people voluntarily submitting, and we have to go on the good faith that people are operating under good faith with this, which, as Bill pointed out, is problematic in and of itself. But that's sort of how we have to operate with most of this stuff. You have to assume that everybody else at an international scale is not secretly working to undermine you, or else you end up in a Cold War.
The nuclear stuff is pretty easy to control because it requires certain heavy industries and stuff that are easy to detect. But
really rare components, yeah.
Right, this kind of robot stuff would not. It's pretty much, you have a warehouse and you can do anything you want. Put a supercomputer in a mechanical shop and there you go.
Yeah, well, so Dan made the point that it's true that anybody's going to be able to build them, but building them at a scale where it starts to be a threat to international peace might be a little bit more like building a nuclear weapon, in virtue of the fact that somebody's going to notice where all that fucking titanium is going, and all these chips and that kind of stuff. Yeah, so Jeff just said that's where the self-reproduction and AI starts to come in. Turning everything into paper clips. So nanobots and stuff like that, autonomous things that part of their directive is to break down other components and to build them into themselves. But that's worrying for a whole separate kind of reason.
Yeah, when the robots are restructuring themselves, especially restructuring their directives, their protocols, what constraints they operate under. From the biological standpoint, that's when the real questions of autonomy come online. Yeah.
And Bill said a minute ago maybe the goal would be to make them just as controllable as the soldier, but that seems like way too low of a bar to set, right? Because soldiers can, and we expect them to, make a decision about the orders that they're being issued, right? Post-Nuremberg trials, we've decided that I was just following orders is no longer a good excuse for gunning down a bunch of civilians. We expect individuals to evaluate the orders that they're being given in the situations that they're in. Presumably, at least at first, we don't want autonomous weapons to be able to do that kind of thing, to override the right, unless you're calling to override the trigger pull, or the fail to trigger pull, because it thinks that your orders are just bad. You don't realize how bad these guys are, or you're giving them a bad rap or something like that. So we want it to be more constrained than a human soldier, but maybe in different ways than a human soldier is.
Perhaps.
So I guess I'm having the thought that focusing on these constraints will be helpful, but it kind of reinforces the inevitability issue, right? It makes a lot of our work about when and where these machines are going to be killing things, which is just to build killbots. I mean, you might think if we didn't focus on this at all and just built robots to do useful things, that they might not ever have their own motivation to pick up a weapon in the first place. That somehow the focus on the military is itself the focus on the military issues is itself part of the problem.
Yeah, that seems overly naive about not necessarily the motivations of the machines themselves, but about the motivations of the designers. I think Bill's right that we probably have to operate on the assumption that at some point this is going to be an issue, no matter what we attempt to do, and that we need to have a fairly coherent plan in place about how we're going to handle it when these things start popping up. And just telling everybody not to do it is probably not going to be sufficient to prevent it from happening.
Yeah.
So
I mean, I guess I just worry that there's some acceleration going on by even having the petition.
So this is the worry. This is exactly the worry about geoengineering. I mean, it's exactly a parallel argument to what people make, that that just by having the conversation, just by having the debate, it makes people less inclined to do mitigation efforts for climate change. That's a moral hazard, and that encouraging the research is going to dampen the efforts to actually make meaningful political progress now toward cutting greenhouse gas emissions or something like that. But I mean, that doesn't seem like a particularly good argument for banning or for issuing a general ban against developing a technology or doing research on a technology for the reasons that I said at the beginning. Rather, it seems like a good reason to develop a robust international regulatory framework, a set of criteria for evaluating when this should be deployed, how it should be deployed, what the consequences are if somebody deploys it contra these regulations. And it seems like the same kind of thing is going to be the case here. That rather than an outright ban, it makes more sense to sit down and develop a policy framework for how we're going to handle it.
Okay, so I want to turn the conversation a little bit, if I could. We've been talking a lot about essentially military robots, which we think are inevitable, but let's ignore those. Let's put those aside and say, okay, on that side of the wall is all the people that are evil, and they're building military robots. What about the other side of the wall, the people that are just building robots that are more and more autonomous, closer and closer to a true AGI? Do those two need regulations, and do those two, what would those kinds of regulations be? But I mean, where does that take us is the open question.
The closer that it gets to a genuine, robust, full general artificial intelligence, presumably the more the regulations are going to converge on the existing legal framework, right? Because the more we're going to be inclined to think that something that's autonomous in that sense and that's intelligent in that sense is an agent in pretty much the same kind of sense that we are. So the constraints on its action are, unless we have an overriding reason to think that they should be different, it seems like they ought to trend toward the same kind of legal framework that's applicable to any other kind of agent in the system.
That's an excellent point. So just like I can't go out and murder something, it can't go out and murder something.
Right, and with the same sorts of pressures in place, right? That if it's intelligent like you are, presumably it has similar sorts of motivations to avoid doing that. It has similar sorts of reasons to avoid doing that, whether those are self-preservation things or more sophisticated positions about ethics or sophisticated self-interest stuff. But yeah, I mean, it seems like the kinds of pressures that if it's intelligent in the same way that a person is, it's going to be sensitive to the same kinds of pressures on behavior that a person is, at least to a large extent. I don't know how Dan feels about this. He looks grumpy.
Yeah, I don't like that. Yeah. Are we asking about civilian robots in terms of whether they are killbots or whether they're making kill decisions, or are we just talking about their autonomy generally?
Well, the kill decisions to some extent, but it's like what controls them? What keeps them from killing people or from making the whole world into paper clips or anything? How do such, good and helpful robots that are truly autonomous, like generally intelligent, how do we control them?
How do we prevent the robot apocalypse, basically,
Yeah.
as we develop this kind of technology? I mean, one of the worries that Bill's been articulating the whole time is that even if it's not designed to kill, right, the smarter something gets, the more resourceful it's going to be, and the more able it is to turn pretty much anything it wants to into a weapon, right? So
I really think the obsession with weapons is, I mean, it's not even just a human thing. I think it's just an American thing. There's a lot of other things to do in the world besides being violent.
Sure, but even even the good things like making paper clips can destroy us all.
Yeah, here's maybe even more pressing question: how do we stop the human apocalypse? It's an open standing question. It's also not easy.
We have a really concrete plan. Just no one listens to us.
Well, I mean, dealing with hostile and uncooperative agents is a lot of what our social systems are designed to do.
Yes.
So I don't think that's the big problem. I think in other words, I think we have a lot of resources for dealing with uncooperative agents already. I think the bigger issue is just recognizing them as agents in the first place. I think for our legal systems to even start to apply, it's not just when they reach a level of sophistication, but also when we reach a social consensus that they are in fact agents. And I think that's the bigger challenge, not how do we control them, but how do we recognize that they're agents that need controlling in the first place. In other words, that we don't have control.
Yeah, I mean, once you even, as soon as you start asking that kind of question, you're already granting at least a degree of autonomy to the system, right? If you start asking questions about how can we control this, I mean, you don't have that sort of worry about something that's just an inert object, right? I don't worry about how to control the books on my desk. In general, I don't have similar sorts of worries about how to control my car, not in the same sense, at least, right? And the closer something slides in the direction of being an agent in its own right, the more you start to have that kind of concern. But at the same time, the more sensitive something like that becomes to the subtle kinds of, I think, social pressures that keep other agents from acting in worrying ways. I mean, you were sort of frowning at that kind of thing earlier, Dan. I don't know what you were worried about with that. That seems sort of more or less in line with what you think. I mean, that we don't need a specific control structure designed for dealing with autonomous machines in society, that once they're at the point of being generally intelligent, they're going to be controlled by the structures that are in place already.
Yeah, I mean, I think there might be some relevant differences that require different kinds of control structures. I also just think that our existing control structures are anthropocentric, so they might not apply, and so there's reasons to change our existing control structures. Like another thing is that I think our discussion in terms of constraints helps a lot, but in terms of just meaningful control, it makes it ambiguous because the military might just say might just claim that they have control over something that really doesn't look like very much control. I'm thinking of like Abu Ghraib, or deny that they have control. Those were a few bad apples. Well, not really. You were cultivating a culture that encouraged people to do exactly that. Yeah.
That's a really interesting point. And that sort of, it wraps it around kind of to the beginning, where the reason that all of this is worrying is because of the attribution of moral responsibility, right? Like that's the reason that this whole debate kind of comes up in a practical sense in the first place. I mean, autonomy is relevant to normative ethics, at least, in the sense that it gives you some sense of who is praiseworthy and who is blameworthy, like who's the kind of thing, or what's the kind of thing that can bear that sort of social onus. I can't blame books for hurting people, in the same sense that I don't worry about how to control books, right? But the more autonomous something gets, the more it gets out of your direct control, the more plausible it is to directly blame that thing for its actions. rather than try to blame an operator. I mean, go ahead.
Yeah, it's interesting that, first of all, our rules for agents seem to be becoming more and more like thought police. So, like, parents now are sometimes getting in trouble for letting their kids run free. Or, it's like, well, did the child actually get hurt? No. Well, what's the problem? And
no meaningful parental control.
Right, but it is meaningful parental control. If it's a well-behaved child, they're not in trouble. They haven't done anything wrong. So, but we do the same thing with many other actions that aren't coming to mind right now. So we're sort of
That's
blaming
a nice parallel. I like that.
agents that aren't really responsible on one hand, and then on the other hand, when we get beyond anthropomorphic and get to corporations and stuff, we're having a really hard time controlling them in any meaningful way. And I think a lot of AIs will be that kind. They won't be the embodied kind that live in a single robot body. They will be some larger entity. How do we control such a thing? I don't know.
That's a great question. I mean, and that's the sort of thing that Dan had in mind when he said that a lot of our existing systems of control are anthropocentric. One of the things to be concerned about is that most of our laws and most of our ways of thinking about this stuff are designed to deal with agents who are more or less spatially localized, right? Who are in one place at one time, and you can go there and put them in handcuffs or whatever, right? Something like a distributed intelligence, the way to design constraints for that is significantly more challenging and going to involve, I think, significantly more creative thinking. It's not going to be sensitive to the same kind of stuff that a localized intelligence is.
But our strategies for dealing with it are in terms of corporate personhood is to map it onto the way that we treat people.
That's right, yeah. And you might think something similar is likely to happen with other kinds of distributed intelligence. To have some sort of mapping function, right, where we figure out how to convert it, at least at first, until we get used to dealing with that kind of organism in its own right.
I mean, this is really why I want to go back to systems biology as a paradigm case of autonomy, where the functional organism, I mean, the organism is functionally integrated in a way that defines autonomy for itself and not for other things. So I think the general framework for autonomy has to be in terms of functional integration, that all the parts are contributing to the perpetuating of the system. And I think we can. I think there's mappings of that framework of autonomy onto distributed corporate personhood. It's a little bit harder to do it for people because of the social dimensions of our personhood, but I think it can be done, and I think the same thing will. Yeah, but this is a bigger project.
Yeah, that's our other long-term goals. Yeah.
It sounds like what you're saying there is the entity that you're talking about is a central core of control, essentially. So like a bacteria controls its own body, and beyond its body is its environment. The same way we control our body, and beyond it is the environment. Same thing with a corporation. It would have something which would be considered its body, its sphere of control, and beyond that is its environment.
Yeah.
Is that what you're saying?
You are wherever you have control.
Yeah. The bacteria just is that combined control, the functional control of all the parts, how they control each other in an integrated way so that the whole system hangs together.
Correct.
A part of the problem with the robots is that they don't hang together. The whole point of this conversation is to try to figure out how they hang on us, or how much they should hang on us. And the deeper question of autonomy is how does the robot hang together itself? But that's not in this discussion yet. That's too far in the. We need machines that can do a lot more things before we get into that discussion.
Before that becomes a worry, yeah.
Yes, but that will be coming.
And faster than we think.
Yeah,
So
most definitely.
We've been going for an hour and a half. I think this is probably a good place to
Okay.
stop. I don't know if anyone wants to say any final words before I cut the broadcast.
I don't think we actually came to a decision there, but it was an interesting conversation.
Well, let's come to a decision then. I think. Well, so let me give final thoughts then. Closing argument.
Closing argument, yeah.
I think the phrase "meaningful human control" is ambiguous, but it's at least helpful for talking about these constraints. And I think the discussion made me. I had already signed the petition, but I think this discussion made me a lot more hopeful that there's some room to actually at least define these constraints. Not that people will listen to them, but at least we can do something formal that might actually have some teeth. And for that reason, I think the petition is doing the right thing. That it's worth signing and backing the petition in order to get these kinds of goals. And we don't have them yet, but I think they're possible. Yeah.
Or at least to raise the conversation and get the conversation going. Yeah, I mean, I guess the thing that I would come down to is that rather than a ban on it, I want a regulatory framework, and that's what I think is worth shooting for. And that's the reason that I've been hesitant to sign this thing is because it pushes for an outright ban, and I think that's the wrong approach to take to this. I think it's a head in the sand kind of approach to dealing with it. I think that the more responsible thing to do is to go after some consensus on what the criteria for meaningful human control and autonomy look like, what the penalties are going to look like, and to develop some sort of international body that's supposed to oversee this in a robust way.
So if we have those criteria, couldn't we then set up a ban saying like, all robots have to meet 3-star rating or whatever?
Yeah, I think that's reasonable. But we need to have the conventions in place first, I think, before we start demanding bans on things.
Yeah.
And you don't think having the ban helps develop those conventions?
No, if anything, the opposite.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah. So the question would be is like ban exactly what?
Yeah.
That's the question. So great conversation, guys. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, thanks for joining us.
This was a lot of fun.
Yep, it was. All right, we good?
I'm good.
See ya.
Yep, have a good night.
Bye, John.